Și am ajuns și la ultima sesiune a mesei rotunde de astăzi, în care vom avea o prezentare a unui ghid privind garantarea siguranței persoanelor LGBTQI+, care lucrează pentru organizațiile societății civile. Acesta este un ghid produs de către Safeguarding Hub pentru Europa de Est. El este disponibil cel puțin în limba engleză și în limba română. Nu-mi reamintesc acum dacă, probabil că și în celelalte limbi, în rusă și ucraineană. Și o avem pe Ilaria alături de noi. Da, te văd, Ilaria. Ce voiam să adaug este că, deși acest ghid are ca și grup țintă ONG-urile, măsurile care vor fi prezentate pot fi aplicate de către orice angajator, da? De către orice entitate. Ilaria, îți voi da cuvântul ție pentru a ne prezenta ghidul. Mulțumesc!
Thank you so much, Elena, and thanks everyone for having me here today. I assume it's easier if I also switch off my camera for the presentation, but I just wanted to say hello, introduce myself. As Elena said, I'm Ilaria Michelis. I'm a consultant working on safeguarding as well as LGBT inclusion and gender-based violence. And I'm presenting this report here today because I worked on the development of the pocket guide. It's quite a long pocket guide, but the guide on how to safeguard in LGBTQI plus individuals working in NGOs. And I co-authored this with my colleague Festus Kisa, who is a human rights activist working on LGBTQI plus rights in Kenya as well. Just a little bit of background regarding the guide. So we developed this guide by, sorry, I was just seeing my image, so I got distracted. So we developed this guide through a series of consultations with LGBTQI plus organizations working across different contexts. We consulted partners working in Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, East and West Africa, as well as consulting a range of documents from Europe, Latin America, the Caribbean, again, Africa, East Asian, Australia as well. So we wanted this guide to be quite, all-encompassing, but of course that means that, a lot of it is, needs to be contextualized. So as we go through the presentation, I hope you will keep in mind how this can be contextualized for Romania, and as well as, perhaps in the discussion after, if we have time, share how you think some of these recommendations can be best made appropriate for your contexts. So next slide, please. I wanted to start with this quote, which we collected during the consultations for the Pocket Guide, which says, "We must start from the recognition that LGBT people are everywhere. They are in programs, they are our staff, they are our partners." And I think this has been mentioned earlier today as well, but I think it's a really important starting point when we think about safeguarding and inclusion more broadly, because a lot of LGBTQI people might not want to share their gender identity, their sexual orientation, especially in a professional context, so in their workplace. Therefore, we must assume, whether we know that someone in our team is a member of the LGBT community or not, we must assume that someone is, and we must develop our policies, our safeguarding policies, and think about, our organizational culture, which we will talk about later, starting from that assumption. And as Elena said, this pocket guide is focused on staff. so LGBTQI plus staff members or volunteers or, consultants, collaborators of NGOs, but also of, any kind of employer really. But I would say that some of the recommendations that we'll go through today, because they concern organizational culture and capacity, will actually not just make your organization a safer place to work in, but make your organization a safer place for every kind of LGBTQI plus person, including the refugees and the other program participants that you work with. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give you a quick overview of what is inside the pocket guide so that you can, kind of get a sense of what you can find in it, although we won't cover everything today for reasons of time. So there is some guidance around language, use of language, and there is a glossary that covers some of the most common terminology when it comes to LGBTQI plus community, sexual orientation, gender identity, sexual expression, and sexual characteristics. However, because this guide is so broad, it must be said that we do recommend in the pocket guide itself to take a very localized approach to understand what is the most appropriate language for your context and for the context the people you're working with are coming from as well. Then there are three main sections in the pocket guide. The first one is an overview of the risks of harm and abuse that LGBTQI plus people that work in the non-governmental sector might face as within the workplace or as a consequence of their employment in this sector. We won't cover those today, but I would say that, well, a few of these are things that have already been mentioned earlier today. Some are things that haven't come up, especially around the potential of blackmail, specific form of digital abuse that might face LGBTQI staff members. So I would really recommend you go and look at the second section of the guide when you have time. And then the two areas that we'll focus on today are the section that looks at what happens when safeguarding approaches are not inclusive. So what are the risks of harm that LGBTQI plus persons will experience in your organization if the safeguarding is not made inclusive from the start. And then what we'll spend most of our time today, hopefully responding to some of the invitations that came out in the opening addresses today, we'll focus on very practical recommendations on how to make safeguarding policies and practices more inclusive. Throughout the pocket guide, we follow sort of the cycle of safeguarding. So every section is divided into prevention of sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment, and other safeguarding risks, reporting, so reporting mechanisms in particular, and how to ensure that abuses are reported safely, and then response. So what happens when someone does report? What is the response of the organization? And so we'll also follow that format today for the recommendations that we go through. Next slide. Thank you. So I'll just give you an overview of some of the, the overall risks that come to LGBTQI plus people that work for an NGO or another kind of organization if safeguarding approaches, safeguarding policies, safeguarding reporting mechanisms are not designed to be specifically and explicitly inclusive of LGBTQI plus people and their issues. So what we see happening is that when LGBTQI plus staff experience abuse within the organization, they often, and here I'm following sort of the internal circle, the main circle, we'll go back to that other sort of green square on the right hand side. But when LGBTQ staff experience abuse, very often they do not report the abuse. And this is because similar to what has been discussed earlier around program participants and refugees, staff members do not believe that the organization considers what they have experienced as abuse. It might be because they are not sure that the kind of things their experiences are actually abuse, because they're not mentioned in safeguarding policies, for example. And it might be because they are too scared of what will happen if they report. And in that process, they have to disclose their sexual orientation or gender identity, and what might be the consequences of that information being shared with some members of staff and the leadership of the organization. And so when these kind of abuses against LGBTQI plus staff are not reported, as a consequence, the fact that this abuse is happening is not perceived, is not acknowledged by the organization. And within the organization, it's quite likely that these kind of abuses are then considered acceptable. And so again, the LGBTQ staff member might feel that actually what's happening is not such a big deal. Maybe I'm blown it over out of proportion, or maybe, yes, I am harmed by this, but actually the organization thinks that's okay. And on the other hand, a potential perpetrator of abuse might also feel like what they're doing is actually not so bad. It's not a form of abuse. It's not considered a safeguarding violation, and the organization kind of condones it or thinks it's okay. And so here we kind of close the cycle. That means that because these forms of abuse are not recognized, then and they're not made visible within the organization, then organizations feel like they don't need to care about that. Therefore, they don't need to make their policies and safeguarding approaches more inclusive. And so what is required is really to sort of interrupt this cycle by operating at the top there in that dark blue box, by making safeguarding policies and approaches inclusive, because, as I said, we know that some people in the organization will benefit from that. And then as you do that, that cycle can be interrupted. And it's also worth noting that some of the risks that are covered in the pocket guide are risks that might emerge if LGBTQ staff do choose to share what has happened to them. So they do report abuse that they have encountered. But when policies and approaches are not inclusive, reporting in itself might constitute a source of harm. And so there are several examples that we collected during our research for the pocket guide, where staff were, for example, outed. So their sexual orientation or gender identity was shared widely within the organization, but even with the community or with the family of the person, resulting in violence, exclusion, stigmatization, and harm. And also examples of where staff had to endure homophobic abuse during the reporting process, because the people who were responsible for handling the complaints were not appropriately trained and or held homophobic and transphobic attitudes themselves. So this is, as I said, an overview of some of these risks. Next slide, please. Here is just a screenshot of what this looks like in the report. We won't have time to go through this section in detail because it's quite it has a lot of elements, but this is just to show you that for this section, you have a table with, in the first columns on the left, an example of a measure in your safeguarding infrastructure, let's say, that is not inclusive of LGBTQI plus staff specifically. In the middle column, you have what are some of the risks that might emerge from not having that inclusion prioritized from the start. And then the third column is a non-exhaustive, but we're trying to give some examples of what might be some of the consequences that might emerge from not thinking in inclusive terms from the very beginning of developing a safeguarding policy and approach and system in the organization. So the example we have here is having awareness sessions about sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment and safeguarding. And in these sessions, there is no mention of abuse against LGBTQI plus staff. And so because this kind of abuse is not mentioned, both LGBTQI staff and potential abusers are not sure, believe that this is not actually a problem and that this is not covered by the safeguarding policies. And therefore, as a consequence, as we said, there might be, there is a sort of permissive attitude within the organization. The LGBTQI staff don't trust the organization. They don't trust that the organization will, care if they report something. And therefore, they might very likely choose not to report. Next slide, please. So I wanted to really spend most of the time today talking about specific recommendations on how to make safeguarding inclusive. And because I feel like there is a hunger in the sector in general on how do we do, to know how we can do this. So I'm going to go through a summary of the recommendations that are included in the report. There's a lot more detail in the pocket guide, and there are additional recommendations as well, but I picked out some of the ones that I thought were most important. I have numbered, you'll see in the next few slides, I've numbered all of the recommendations. And so I would ask you if that's okay, that as we go through, as I talk through the recommendations, you start thinking about which of these recommendations feel doable, feel appropriate in your context, and which ones feel like they might not be appropriate, or you might not be there yet. Not just in your context, in your own organization. So what are things that you can actually start thinking about doing in your organization? And to go back to the opening remarks of the UNHCR representatives, what are some of the recommendations that you might want to put some budget towards already, because you feel this is something that can happen realistically, and which ones are not? So let's start here with some recommendations that look at prevention. So the prevention section is divided in 3 areas that are all essential for prevention: policies, risk assessment and management, and organizational culture, which we'll look at in the next slide. So in terms of policies, it's really essential, as it's been said already, to ensure that LGBTQI plus staff are explicitly included in safeguarding, safety, HR, and all other relevant internal policies, and that these policies take into account what are the specific kind of risks that LGBT populations might face. So you're not just sort of dropping in there like women are at risk and LGBT people are at risk, but you're really thinking through what are the kind of risks that might be faced here that are different, and ensure that these are included in the policies. And then, as we've already mentioned, ensuring that there are these kinds of abuse and against LGBT staff are mentioned as an acceptable behavior when you're doing those awareness sessions, dissemination of policies, but also regular sort of staff meetings and so on. When you're doing a risk assessment activity, which might be something you do at the beginning of a new project or a specific activity, ensuring that members of the LGBTQI plus community are involved in that process. This might be staff members that are out and visible in the organization and are willing to participate in this. Of course, they shouldn't be forced to do so. But if you don't have any out members in your organization, that's fine. There are organizations that you can rely on, as already discussed today, as well as previous studies and research that might have been done in the context that you can draw from as well. Consider the risks that are posed by all actors. So when we're thinking about safeguarding our staff, I think sexual exploitation and abuse, the first thing that comes to mind is risks that come from other staff members, for example, a manager, someone in a position of power within the organization. But actually, and especially so for staff members who are LGBTQI, as I think Iftak already shared, thanks for sharing that, there might be risks of safeguarding that come actually from program participants, from community members, from a religious group, from local authorities that might attack, might abuse, might blackmail an LGBTQI plus staff member if they find out about their sexual orientation or gender identity. And so all of these potential risks need to be included in your risk assessment and in the policies, as I said earlier. And then, of course, related to that, whenever you do a risk assessment, you're also thinking about mitigation strategies. So these risks also need to have corresponding risk mitigation strategies. Next slide, please. Organizational culture. I'd like to start with the quote that's on the right-hand side here, which again is included in the pocket guide. And the quote says, organizational culture is different from local culture. So whilst agencies might not be able to significantly change local cultural context, inclusive organizational culture is an important factor in LGBTI workers' feeling of safety and belonging in the workplace. And I think even for me, reading this was a really important reminder that while we might feel that it's not in our mandate to change how, the community, the nation thinks about LGBT people, it is absolutely in our mandate, in our responsibility to set up an organizational culture, to influence the culture within our organization, to ensure that that is a welcoming and supporting and safe environment for LGBT people. And so how do you do that? Some things have been mentioned, ensuring that there is visible support for LGBT inclusion, not just in safeguarding, but more broadly. And this leadership and support comes from senior management within the organization. There's been a lot of talk already about recruitment, but also ensuring that induction processes. So once you've hired someone, make sure that they are aware from day one that this is in LGBT inclusion and other forms of inclusion and intersectionality, of course, are core values for the organization. And so certain kinds of behaviors or abuse are not going to be accepted. This has been mentioned again, regular training and awareness raising for all staff. And I put that all underlined because I think very often we kind of miss the leadership when we do that kind of training and awareness. And I think because of the importance of, of leadership and, organizational leadership in setting the culture for the organization, ensuring that they are involved in training and awareness raising is important. And also not just doing this through sort of the formal, once a year training on inclusion, but also weaving it through all kinds of activities. So ensuring that, for example, there are posters put up within the organization so that people can think about these things and talk about it while they're having their lunch break, or mentioning it at different, if there is Pride going on in your city around that time, mentioning that during the staff meeting. So making it a topic of conversation throughout the year, not just around that one particular training. And finally, again, this has been already highlighted, but partnering and collaborating with LGBTQI plus organizations in non-extractive ways, as Veronica was saying earlier today, but involving them in the training and awareness raising and ensuring that they are sharing information with you when events are happening so that you can let staff know. And that can be some way that you show that your organization is inclusive. But also vice versa, collaborating in other activities where you might want to, provide a training to the LGBT organization so that or a joint training so that your staff are also, getting to know and being exposed to the work of these organizations. Next slide, please. When it comes to reporting, I know there was a question earlier specifically about how can we do, how can we adapt reporting mechanisms? And I think this is extremely context specific. So the recommendations here might sound a little broad, but I think the barriers that different LGBTQI plus members of the community and the different subgroups within that phase are going to be different. So it is essential to involve those different communities as you're designing reporting mechanisms, or if you already have them in place, as you're adapting them to be more inclusive. One thing that I think Veronica maybe mentioned earlier is considering whether an LGBT organization might be interested and willing to act as an additional entry point for reporting, so that your staff can go to them to seek advice, to report the case, feeling that they are going to someone who's not going to judge them for their gender identity or sexual orientation. And finally, I'll mention here anonymous reporting. I think can be a very powerful tool to encourage staff members who might not want to share their sexual orientation or gender identity and kind of have that associated with their name to report. And that might not result in a direct investigation of a particular case, but once, maybe multiple reports are made around, the same kind of behavior, then that can trigger, the organization taking action in that direction. Next slide, please. So finally, some recommendations around how to adapt our response system when a report of abuse against an LGBTQI plus staff member is made. This is divided in report handling and investigation, and then services and support that you might refer the person who's making the complaint to. For both of these, a survivor-centered approach is essential, and a survivor-centered approach means many things that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but I think here I really want to stress that we say that for every survivor, they are the best person to determine what is safe for them, and they are the best person to determine what services are appropriate for them. This could not be truer for LGBTQI people who have, in most situations, been managing their own sexuality and gender identity and the risks that society poses for a very long time. So they are absolutely the best experts in this process. And so it's essential that organizations do not sort of impose mitigation measures, such as deciding that this person is no longer going to be working in this area, or without consulting with them and ensuring that they are the ones making that decision. Another thing that can be done is consider enhanced confidentiality measures during the investigation. So, for example, restricting the number of people that are involved in an investigation if either party, whether the complainant or the alleged perpetrator, are, have a diverse sexual orientation or gender identity or are suspected. Important, again, like every investigation, you're not required to know everything about that person's life or sexual history. So much truer, again, in the case of people from the community. You don't need to know about their transition journey, how many, whether they have sexual same-sex relationships in the past, if it's not relevant to the abuse that you're dealing with. Of course, having dedicated training on investigation, not just on generic inclusion, but on investigation with LGBTQI plus people for those that might be involved in that investigation. And again, this might be an opportunity to partner with LGBTQI plus organization, invite them to be on investigation panels for specific cases. And for time, I'm going to skip possibility of, no, I'm going to skip the 19, the possibility of malicious reporting, but we can talk about that in the Q&A if we do have time. But it's quite a long and a complicated issue, so I don't want to sort of lose you in the way. For services and support, this again has been mentioned in terms of ensuring that LGBTQI organizations or organizations that are LGBTQ friendly are included in the referral pathway, and that people and that everyone that reports, not just those that report and in that process share they have a diverse sexual orientation or gender identity, but ensuring that everyone who reports is getting the information about LGBTQ friendly services, because you might have a lot of people that are reporting to you not sharing certain aspects of your identity, and so that information needs to be available to everyone. And if you are going to refer or include in your referral pathway other organizations that are not known to be LGBTQ friendly, then rapidly assessing whether they're open and able to support LGBTQ people can be very important. And you don't need to have an assessment tool, a checklist to do that. Someone suggested in terms of recruitment using scenarios. That's a very good idea for assessing service providers' capacities as well, asking what would you do if a trans woman came to this service? How would you handle that? Or have you previously provided services to members of the LGBT community? How did that go? And so on. Next slide, please. So we're coming to a close. I know that was a lot of information shared in a very quick amount of time. And as I said, there are even more recommendations in the pocket guide, but I did want to kind of summarize it, that while it might seem overwhelming, actually, we're really only talking about keeping in mind these 5 principles. Visibility, so visible support for the LGBT community and visibility of LGBTQI plus staff in this case, in your policies, in your documents, in your program documents, and so on. Ensuring a survivor-centered approach, so ensuring that LGBTQI plus staff are the ones calling the shots when abuses are being reported or when the system is being designed. Partnership and consultation with LGBTQI specialist organizations, that's been talked a lot about, so I won't go over that. Ensuring that you are investing. This is where some of the funding could go towards, in capacity and awareness raising for the staff at every level. Again, partner with LGBT organization if possible. And finally, adaptation. So it isn't sort of sufficient, I think, as Iftak was saying, to just say, oh, we are inclusive, we put things in the policies, we said we're inclusive, therefore we're inclusive. To build that trust that is missing right now, you have to show that you are changing the way you're doing things. You're adapting your services, you're adapting your reporting mechanisms, you're adapting how your meetings are conducted in order to address what are some of the barriers and vulnerability that LGBTQI plus members of the community are facing. And so actually talking about it, training about it, but also making changes based on that are kind of the key things that I think need to be done. So next slide, please. Here's where you can download the pocket guide. You have the QR code on the left is for the Romanian language one, and the one on the right is for English, or you have the link underneath for the other languages as well are included there. Sorry, this is going a little over time, but thank you for sticking with this, and I very look forward to any questions or feedback that you might have.
Thank you very much, Ilaria. I think there were a lot of key and useful safeguarding inclusive measures at the workplace for the LGBT staff. I would like to open the floor to questions first. If there are any. Yes.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I have a question more on reporting mechanisms, and I was wondering if you can share with us if you have some additional information on how would look like some examples of inclusive reporting mechanisms, because what I think we are facing now, and maybe others are facing the same challenges, is a challenge of underreporting. So we are wondering from studies or what you have seen, if there are some examples on how to be better on that.
Thank you, Roxana.
Thank you. Shall I answer?
Yes, please.
Okay. So thanks for that question. And yeah, I think that, as I said, I think that is a very context-specific issue because there will be different barriers in different contexts. But just a few things that come to mind is one, and we know this for all kinds of reporting, not just for LGBTQI people or staff, is that trust is the main barrier, right? Like not trusting that the mechanism is going to respond appropriately. So I think investing in building that trust is a real key to having more successful reporting mechanisms, and that can be done through all of that work that has been already talked about in terms of cultural or organizational culture and demonstrating your support for the LGBT community as an organization. Having staff that are sort of the ones that are first respondents when a report is being made, having them really well trained in how to speak about LGBTQI issues, how to understand the specific kinds of abuse that might be faced. One thing that was quite specific, but I think we like specificity here, is considering that because there is a lot of digital abuse against members of the LGBT community, only having digital reporting mechanisms might be a turnoff, because there is so much concern around public personal information around sexual orientation or gender identity being shared online, that actually having to put something in an email or in an online form might feel very dangerous and very scary specifically for members of the LGBT community. So not having, as we say again for all kinds of reporting mechanisms, having multiple entry points, I think, and considering the particular issues around digital is one of them that came up. Having LGBTQ organizations as potential entry points. I know this is creating an additional burden on LGBTQI plus organizations. We're like creating so much work for them just through this conversation today, if we were to kind of follow through with all of them. But if you have a strong and valid partnership with an organization that is not just, again, extractive and can you please do all of these things for me that I can't be bothered to do, but rather it's a real meaningful partnership, then I think that can be also a really valuable addition to your reporting mechanism and structure. And then finally, and this is just a generic recommendation that I would make for any kind of safeguarding, is being extremely clear in your communication. Before someone reports, they need to know what is going to happen, who is going to receive that report, who is going to read the details of that report, who is that information going to be shared with, and then what is going to happen. Is the alleged perpetrator going to be informed about who made the report? So giving as much detail as possible as about that process, I think would be very helpful. And I can just share, sorry, to take up more time, but like personally, when I faced abuse, I did not report because I did not think that my organization, I did not want anyone in my organization to know about my sexual orientation, and I wasn't sure, I didn't know if I reported what would happen to that report, who would be informed, would my manager be informed. I really didn't want my manager to know. So I think those are some of the things that, can be thought of.
Thank you, Ilaria. Are there more questions? Yes, Rodi.
În România, bună ziua, sunt Rodica Nuvac de la Fundația Terre des Hommes. În România există mai multe mecanisme prin care același tip de abuz poate fi soluționat. Există o cercetare disciplinară, există posibilitatea de a apela la Agenția Națională privind combaterea discriminării și există posibilitatea, cel puțin în organizația noastră, a unei cercetări interne. Până acum nu am văzut niciodată o analiză a celor 3 opțiuni și care dintre ele este cea mai potrivită pentru a fi aplicată în cazul unui abuz în organizație, și vreau să întreb ce părere aveți despre acest lucru.
I think that's a great question, and I think understanding how those different systems are related, and also how a person who's thinking about reporting is thinking about each of these potential options, and what are the different risks involved in each of these options, who is going to be involved, etc., are really essential questions to ask. I'm not the person that can answer that question, unfortunately. I think maybe Ruth can answer that question in the room. Maybe other, I think that is a great question that needs to be asked to LGBTQI staff members in Romania, to understand, to center their knowledge and their, understanding of those processes and the risk that they would be facing there. I'm sorry, I'm not, I'm not based in Romania, so I cannot really speak to that. But I think those are, it's essential to understand as well, if does someone fear, for example, and this is something that came up a lot in regard to the pocket guide, for countries where homosexuality is illegal. Is there an assumption that if you report abuse within your organization and it's a criminal matter, for example, it's a case of rape, the police would be informed, and therefore people might not want to report at all because they don't want to be investigated by the police for their sexual orientation and abuse, right? And so if there is a connection between sort of internal, national, ombudsman's, different, systems that might be present, then that adds a potential level of risk or misunderstanding for someone who wants to report. I don't know if that was a helpful kind of addition to that, but I think the question itself needs to go to someone from the community.
Unfortunately, Ruth left. But we can ask this question to her, and I hope she will give us an answer. Rodi, were there any other questions? I think I saw someone else with, yes, Constantina.
I don't have a question, just I wanted to say like a big thank you for building this tool, and to underline that realizing that within our own organizations this is a question and this is something we should keep working on and not taking it for granted is already a start. Because when we had, my experience from trainings is that when we had discussions on vulnerabilities, on risks, on positions of power, many times staff of organizations took for granted that either ethnic minorities, people with other diversities, people with specific needs, including members of the LGBTIQ+ community, would be fine within the NGO or within the international organization, and that this is not a place where it's, dangerous or where there is safeguarding considerations. And it's very important to break this false, idea that, NGOs, that's fine. We're humanitarians, we're good people, we're not a risk for our own colleagues or for the people we try to help. This is already a good start, that we put the question on the table, and thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Constantina. I guess I would still like to go back to, the question that Ilaria has asked you all at the very beginning. If you could reflect a bit on all that set of recommendations that was presented and think about where are you, where is your organization in terms of implementing those? And what would you see as priorities to integrate in your budget planning? Anyone? Yes.
Thank you. I think as a small NGO, we have had to learn by doing a lot of the things, because in this crisis that we have been facing for the last more than a year and a half now, a lot of the things we just assumed we knew. We fell in this category that Constantina mentioned. We considered ourselves inclusive. But in reality, I think society-wise, we have so much internalized prejudice in all areas, not just LGBTQI plus related, that a lot of the things we don't know, we are not aware we don't know. So I would say this is a great starting point, opening up the discussion. Things are put in the policies and they are written down, and there are staff trainings on this, but it still falls under mandatory induction process, and it's not always a real open conversation. I realized, just to give a tiny example, when you were doing the recommendations and earlier, I realized that although we have asked for support from dedicated NGOs that work with LGBTQI plus people in the refugee center initially when we set things up, and we advertised as a friendly space, and we took many steps, as many as we could think of and that were suggested to us. Still, our data anonymization process, for instance, is well, we created it so that to limit the risk of data breach in personal data protection. So we have this anonymization system that we use: X for women, Z for man, Y for man, and Z for kids, and then a series of digits. And I just realized that this is one of the internalized things that we didn't think to address, because, and of course, the legislation in Romania mandates that we look at the paperwork and we register as such, because we don't have gender fluidity in the Romanian legislation yet. So this is one of the aspects that, although we have worked proactively in addressing this potential risk, this slipped by us, and it needs to be rectified, and it needs to be addressed going forward. And I'm sure there are lots and lots and lots of other tiny things that add up to a lot of internalized prejudice on this as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Lori. Mihaela?
Thank you. I mean, so many valuable things have been said here, and I just had the feeling maybe it's about the small steps, about talking about this, you know, little by little. You first do it with the colleagues, or first of all, it starts with us. How much do I understand? I don't understand enough, so I'm not there yet, so I'm not connected enough. It always starts with this time of reflection, which is so needed after such an event, to go through all the thoughts. What can I do? At least a tiny bit, not everything. So then talk, maybe this on unofficial conversations in the break, lunch break, at work, try to introduce the topic, see what the colleagues think about before you do the big strategy. Then this is one aspect, a bit of the informal aspect and self-reflection. Then I think, at least from my perspective, it is very useful to have a bit of like the standard. These are the standards. You work with us, you comply. This is, please do this. Maybe not like by force, but it must be a standard. There must be a standard. And I would greet this, because usually change doesn't happen easily, and you need kind of reference or some rules. Even in society, change doesn't happen easily. And then otherwise, I just wanted to say that it's not only related to LGBTQI, it's just usually that I have noticed some degrees of resistance to change in the society, and I feel them. It's, you know, sometimes when you have a new idea, it's enough. It's whatever new idea you have, people are used, they're in their comfort zone and they're not very open. Maybe you feel they fear something. Why is there that fear there? So overall, I would always challenge this idea of tolerance in the Romanian society. I think there are parts of open society and parts of kind of a closed society. So it's a very sensitive thing to produce change, or to make people sensitive towards change. Yeah, because I realize it's in our responsibility, or we have kind of a bit of a power to change things, but it's little by little. That was it. A bit general, but my reflections. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Is there one last question? Yeah.
Thank you. Is just a last comment, because I saw it was mentioned in your presentation about the role of senior management. I think it's very important to have the senior management on board in this discussion around SEA, because as it happens at the government level, it's the politicians who make the law, and they are the key stakeholders. And I feel sometimes the senior management, as in this presentation, they are not targeted in our awareness raising, in our training, because they are the country rep, they are busy. But in my experience, it's when the country representative or the chief of mission or the senior management is really on board that the work environment changes. It's about SEA, it's about inclusion, it's about everything. So I would really flag and second it what our colleagues said on the need to have our senior management on board in all organizations at all levels. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all very much. I think we are going to close this last session because we have already passed the agreed time. Constantina, do you have any closing remarks?
I just wanted to thank you all for that and for being here today. This is a very important step, not the first step, but an important step, and we want to have more discussions on this very specific and very important topic, and we want to have more interaction with LGBTI plus organizations. There is action points when it comes to programming specifically for LGBTI plus refugees and their inclusion in services provided by the humanitarian response. And we continue to invite the specialized organizations to come to the table, make proposals, seek help for funding these proposals. We are there with the RRP, with our own protection and our own programming activities, and we're looking to strengthen these alliances and to strengthen these partnerships, because I reiterate that this is something we can do together. We need the specialized organization, and we can also offer support to them to get the support they need, both technically in terms of funding and in terms of visibility with the international community, with the authorities, and with including donors. Thank you.
Thank you, Constantina. And well, from my side, a big thank you as well for your time, for your interest. A big thank you to Constantina, to Pablo, to Laura, to Cristiana, who helped me put together this event. I guess one takeaway from my side is that it takes time to create change, especially on this topic. But I really do hope that through today's roundtable we manage to raise more awareness. We manage to present some tools that can be, contextualized and applied within your very own organizations.